So we'll get started. Just some housekeeping announcements. If you're a member of the public, please mute yourself. We will try to have a public comment period at the end of the meeting if time allows. I'll make that determination after the break to see what time we have remaining. And then I'll kind of announce the process for public comments if that's available. And for the members, we'll go through roll call. Nick, if you're on the line, if you want to go ahead and start the roll, that'd be great.
Yeah, give me 1 second here just to pull up the list. Okay, I'll start the roll call. This is in no particular order. Do we have Dr. Tom Jean?
Present.
Barbara Hansen?
Here.
Ali Hamadi?
Yeah, hello.
Dr. Sarah present?
Here.
Kevin Fitz?
Yes, Kevin Fitz here.
Dr. Kim Golitz?
Yes, here.
Todd Korthus?
Here.
Dr. Mason Marks?
Present.
Dr. Jesse Euling?
Present.
Dr. Athir Abbas?
I'm here.
David Hart?
Here.
Nathan Ritz?
Present.
Tom Eckert?
Here.
Angela Carter?
Present.
Stephanie Bars?
Present.
Dr. Rachel Knox?
Present.
And Shannon O'Fallon?
Present.
That's the entire committee is present.
All right, thanks, Nick. That's great to hear. Welcome back, everybody. It's been about a month since our first meeting. So I guess what we'll do is we'll just get rolling on the agenda here. Actually, I'm sorry, it's not on the agenda, but we'll take a minute to review the minutes from the last meeting. So I'll give everybody about 2 minutes or so. If you haven't already looked at those minutes, you can, I guess, raise your hand once you're ready and you feel like you've reviewed those minutes sufficiently, and then we'll take a vote to accept those minutes. And they should be attached to the meeting invite. Okay, it looks like most people, half people have raised their hands, and others are looking at the screen like they're waiting for us to make a decision on the minutes. So thank you all for taking a look at those. And anyone opposed to accepting the minutes from the last? I should rather ask, let me ask, are there any changes, any suggested changes or edits to the minutes from last meeting? Okay, hearing none. Anybody opposed to accepting these minutes? Okay, hearing none, we'll accept those minutes and add those to the record and the website after this meeting. All right, thanks everyone. And we'll just keep going along with our agenda here. Shannon Fallon, our DOJ counsel for the board, has agreed to give us a little bit of guidance on board communication. So I'll turn it over to Shannon. Shannon, do you want to share your screen with your PowerPoint, or would you like me to control that?
Yeah, I don't have it up right now, Andre, so if you could.
Okay.
So then I guess I could advance the slides if I did it, couldn't I? All right. So in addition to providing some guidance and sort of an overview of board communications, I'm going to go over, again, so not only public meetings, but also public records law, public records retention laws, and a little bit about ethics. I know somebody can monitor the chat if they're, I'm happy to be interrupted, or we can just take questions at the end. So next slide. Next slide. So we're going to start with the public meetings law. So a public meeting, or the public meetings law, applies to governing bodies of public bodies. So this board is both a public body and a governing body of a public body. But the public meetings law, and this is the part that that people are not always aware of, also applies to advisory committees or subcommittees if they are providing recommendations to a public body. So the subcommittees that are operating right now are subject to the public meetings law. Next slide. So a governing body is the members of a public body consisting of 2 or more members with authority to make decisions or recommendations to the public body. So, even if we don't have all board members present, 2 or more can still constitute a public meeting, depending on sort of the subject of that meeting. And so again, here are the types of meetings that have to comply. Any convening of a governing body for which a quorum is required to make a decision or deliberate towards a decision. So it's, in-person meetings, phone meetings. It can include group email communications, what are called serial email communications that I'll go into a little bit more. It doesn't really matter if you're calling it a lunch meeting. It depends on what the purpose of the meeting is. If you're getting together for purposes of discussing board business, then it could be subject to the public meetings law. Next slide. So if something is subject to the public meetings law, then the meetings have to be open to the public unless there's an executive session, and we'll talk a little bit about that. You have to provide advance notice. So there are times when you can call emergency meetings, and I think that the advance notice is at least 24 hours. I think I'm right about that. You have to say, how people can participate if they can't go to a particular location now in the time of COVID, right? These are all virtual, how people can participate, what the general subject is going to be, right? So generally posting an agenda, and then minutes have to be taken or the meeting has to be recorded. Any votes that happen in the public meeting have to be cast publicly and also recorded. And then meetings have to be accessible to persons with disabilities. I would say that even though public meetings are open to the public and the public have to be able to listen to what is occurring, it is not the case that the public needs to necessarily have an opportunity to participate or to give public comment. Lots of boards and committees do allow that. As Andre said at the beginning, if there's time at the end, you will take public comment, but that is not actually a requirement of the public meetings law. So again, right, there has to be minutes have to be taken or the meeting has to be recorded, an audio recording. And, sort of this slide shows the sorts of things that have to be documented if minutes are taken. Who attended, whether or not there were particular motions or proposals that were brought up, again, recording of the votes, the main substance of the discussions. It doesn't have to be a transcript of this discussion. If you're referring to certain documents in the meeting, those need to be recorded. And then if it's an emergency meeting, there has to be a description of the emergency. And also if the meeting is going to include an executive session, that has to be included as well. Next slide. So again, public meetings, as we all know by now, don't have to be held in person. You can, everyone can be on the phone. They can be virtual, as this one is. And again, except for executive sessions, the public have to be able to listen in real time. And again, you can have meetings, right, where some people are there in person and some people are on the phone. So if we're ever in a place where, we can gather together again, there can always be a mix, right? Because you can have boards and commissions that have people participating from across the state, and sometimes not everybody can be in one place. Next slide. So a public vote is required. And this board, I believe, has fewer than 25 members. So the vote of each member has to be recorded. You cannot vote in executive session, and you can't do secret ballots. You can't vote you can't give a proxy to someone else to vote for you. You can't write your vote down on a piece of paper and hand it to the chair and have them read it. The public needs to be able to know how you as board members voted on a matter. Next slide. So this is a part that I think is really important, and again, not necessarily that evident when you're thinking about the public meetings law. So if you're having private communications, with two board members or a few board members that don't constitute a quorum, you can still run afoul of the public meetings law. There is a Court of Appeals case that has said that a series of private communications can actually constitute a public meeting. So if I'm a board member and I'm emailing with Angela, and then Angela emails with Tom, et cetera, right? And there's a string of emails that board members are a part of, that can constitute a public meeting. And a court could say that you've run afoul of the public meetings law. There wasn't notice, et cetera. The public wasn't privy to those communications, and so any action or deliberations that were taken sort of don't count. So it is DOJ's recommendation that even if you don't have a quorum, that board members not meet in private or talk on the phone in private to discuss business or exchange email communications about the business of the board. And I know that can seem, maybe sort of overly strict, but again, the goal of the public meetings law is to have transparency and for the public to understand the business that the board is conducting. Next slide. Executive session. So an executive session can be called, right, where this is a place where the public can be excluded. You actually can't exclude members of the media that the media is not supposed to report what happened in executive session. But there are circumstances where the board can meet in private to discuss certain things. One of the most sort of usual things is to talk about confidential legal advice or maybe a legal matter that's coming up for the board. So if the board was engaged in some sort of litigation about something, right, and you would ask me for advice, or I'm briefing the board on sort of legal strategies and things, we could meet in executive session to discuss that. And there are some other things as well, but it's not something that gets utilized that often, but is something that that when appropriate can allow for some private communication about sensitive things. But again, the board can't take any action or do any voting in executive session. So you could be briefed on a matter in executive session, then you'd have to come back into public session. And then if you were going to take a particular action, would have to make a motion and vote on that. Next slide. All right, so before, I think I'll just pause there for a second to see if anyone has any questions about the public meetings law material I went over.
Shannon, it's David Hart. Are subcommittee meetings subject to the public records law? And if they are, are these calls being recorded? And what would the quorum be?
Right, so it is my understanding that the subcommittees should be subject to the public meetings law. I mean, we might have to look at the exact makeup of them. I might need to dig a little bit more to make sure that I'm providing the right advice that those subcommittees are subject to the public meetings law. But again, if they are making recommendations to the board, then they should be. And so they can be recorded, they should be noticed. Subcommittees may not necessarily have quorum requirements. I mean, I guess it depends on whether or not the subcommittee is going to be voting. And if the subcommittee is going to be voting on something, then I suppose it's probably a simple majority would be a quorum. So we may need to follow up.
This is Todd with the research subcommittee. Just to be super clear, as long as we are not voting, then we can go about our work in between our scheduled meetings that are public. And where this is coming from is we have a tremendous number of deliverables between now and June 30th. They're not going to get done if they're only done on a 3-hour meeting, or whatever.
But is your subcommittee making recommendations to the board regarding research?
We're doing the background research to make recommendations to the board in a public board meeting. The recommendations wouldn't happen until the board meeting.
Yeah. So
Shannon,
Andre,
I think.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I think Dr. Cortez is trying to get around is that there's a lot of work where the subcommittee has to go and find citations, pieces of literature, and do that type of work outside of a subcommittee meeting. That literature will be brought back before the subcommittee and discussed, and the recommendation will be made there to a larger board. So
right.
it's more like the homework.
Yeah. Homework is not subject to the public meetings law. But it's gathering together. I mean, if you've got the subcommittee members getting together and talking about the research that has been gathered in order to make a recommendation, right, then that is what has to be subject to the public meetings law. Sorry, I think I wasn't understanding what you were saying.
So Shannon, can you speak up a little more about the emailing? Because what if 2 members of the subcommittee are emailing back and forth about, decisions about literature? What does that count, or is that separate?
So that could count. Again, it depends, right? So 2 members of this board are not a quorum, but the concern is, right, that Tom, you and Todd will email, and then there will be this serial email, and at the end of that email string, there will be some decision that you're going to include only this kind of research, and that's going to be put forth to the board. right? So you've circumvented the public meetings law by doing that serial emailing. So I think there are, I think that we can provide some further clarification and sort of guidance to board members about how to avoid that and still be able to do, some amount of communicating with other members outside of public meetings. But you do need to be careful.
I appreciate that clarification. I wonder if one potential way to both move forward in the work and adhere to these regulations are if we divvy up the work and do our literature review and synthesis, emailing back and forth, but don't make decisions on inclusion or exclusion until our public subcommittee meetings. Would that work?
Yeah, I think it would be better to have some of these conversations offline and for Andre and I to talk about. I think, for example, I don't necessarily know the specific facts about how these subcommittees are set up and who's on them and how they're operating, and the facts definitely matter. So some follow-up.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Shannon. This is Dr. Rachel Knox, for the record. And because I also think what is of concern here is the need for fact-finding and discussion, right? Not actually deliberating towards a resolution at all. But we need that time to talk and discuss such that even at a subcommittee meeting, we are well-informed and can use that time productively and efficiently to drive towards resolution then. Because even homework might need to be done within a cohort.
Sure. I think you need to ask yourself whether or not, those conversations are things that the public would be interested in. So I know that there is tension here, right? Because there is important work that needs to be done, and always doing, advance notice and posting an agenda and recording things can be a burden. Okay. I'm gonna go on to the public, another exciting topic, the public records law. So again, right, the general expectation here is transparency. So any record that is retained by the Oregon Health Authority and by this board is going to be considered a public record. And then the question is, if there's a public records request, is it subject to disclosure? Is there some other exception to the public records law that might apply? The courts and the Attorney General's office, let me back up for a second. Right, so anyone, and I'm going to go into this, can submit a public records request, and then if an agency denies all or part of a public records request, then that person can appeal to the Attorney General's office, asking for an order to compel the agency to disclose the public record. So this is like other people in my office that these petitions go to. So both the Attorney General's office and the courts construe exemptions to disclosure very narrowly and are for the most part going to err on the side of disclosure, not non-disclosure. And again, sometimes you hear people talking about FOIA laws, which are the Federal Freedom of Information Act. So, ours is the public record law, but it's similar. Next slide. So as I said, basically anyone can make a public record request. I mean, you do have to fall within the definition of a person, which is, in legal jargon, a natural person is people like you versus a corporation, which is also considered a person, or any other business entities, and members of the Legislative Assembly are also persons. Next slide. I guess I'm going to go into this later, but anyway, I mean, public records requests can be made sort of formally or informally. There's not real magic to it. So what is a public record? As I said, basically it's anything that an agency has retained, has in their, sort of possession. and that is retained sort of regardless of the physical form. So if it's in a database, if it's in a text message, those are all writings that are subject to that are considered public records. It doesn't matter whether or not you have a record that somebody else sent you, right? So it's not a record that you created, you got it from somewhere else. The fact that you as a public body have it means that it's a public record. It doesn't include any writing that doesn't relate to the conduct of the public's business that's contained on a privately owned computer. But the reason that this particular last bullet here is important for you is that if you are doing, for those of you that are not, state employees that may be doing this work on a personal computer, if you have records on that computer that relate to the business that you're doing as a board member, then those are subject to the public records law. So just because they are on your personal computer does not mean that they aren't subject to the public records law. And so if the Oregon Health Authority or the board got a public records request for any emails related to board business in the possession of any of the board members, then you would have to search your email or your computer for things like that. And Andre, are the board members going to get OHA email addresses, or are they going to be using their own personal email addresses?
At this time, they use their own personal email addresses, and I'm not sure what our policy is moving forward. I know that some other boards in this center use personal email addresses as their official board email addresses.
Yeah. So that it's not uncommon, but again, just know, and this will become more important when I talk about records retention, that those emails related to board business are public records. Next slide. Again, so what is a writing, right? And again, it could be anything. It's voicemails, text messages, emails. It could be pictures. Any of those things could be a writing that make it a public record for purposes of the public records law. Next slide. So making a public records request, right? It can be in any format. The agency can require that it actually be in writing versus somebody calling up and saying, "Hey, I want these records." Agencies have to have a written procedure for making a public record available to the public. And in this last sort of box here is a link to OHA's website where you can make a public record request. Next slide. So I put here just a few exemptions that apply under the Public Records Act that might come into play for the board as it does its business going forward. So these are instances, right, where you might have something that's a public record, but the agency says claims an exemption from disclosure and then redacts or holds back entire documents based on the exemption. So one is internal communication. So if the board were working on some sort of public report and it was going back and forth with drafts that can sort of contain opinions from various people about what the final version should look like, and you got a request for any drafts, you could theoretically exempt from disclosure those sort of opinions, those non-facts, at least until the point where the final report is issued. This internal communications exemption does not apply to facts, right? So if you're talking about particular research, for example, that would have to be provided. It's just sort of the internal communications about what should be in the report that could be kept out. Things that concern personal privacy. So let's say board members are emailing with OHA about the availability for a meeting, and somebody says, I can't attend that meeting. I'm having my gallbladder out on Tuesday. You could redact the part that talked about a particular medical condition. As we get, sort of more forward looking, where we have, licensees that are providing services to clients, sort of that client information likely would fall under this personal privacy provision to the extent that that came up. Information submitted in confidence. So if somebody sends information and says, I'm sending this to you, you have to promise me not to share it with anybody else. And there's a promise sort of in return that the agency won't share it. Then that information can also be redacted, or you can refuse to disclose it. It does not apply to any information that somebody is otherwise required by law to submit to you. So if somebody is required to submit information to the board or to the Oregon Health Authority, they can't say, well, I'm submitting this to you in confidence, and so you can't disclose it. That's not how it works. And then if there are other things where disclosure is prohibited under state or federal law, then those are exemptions that would also apply. Next slide. All right, so public records retention. So there's a definition of the public record that applies for purposes of a public records request. That definition is slightly different when you're talking about what has to be retained as a public record. And under the retention law, it's slightly narrower. So you have to retain things that are necessary to satisfy the fiscal, legal, administrative, or historical policies, requirements, or needs of the agency. So again, emails back and forth about meetings. Are you available at 2 o'clock? No, I'm not available till 1:30. Those sorts of things don't necessarily need to be retained because they're not necessary to satisfy any of these things.
Are you making lunch?
And so,
Oh, that's okay. Let me just move.
hey, David, you're off mute.
Oh.
And so you wouldn't necessarily need to retain them. I wouldn't spend, I think that the consequences for not retaining records are serious. So I would not think too hard about like what you need to retain or not retain and err on the side of retention. Next slide. So public records have to be retained for a period according to a retention schedule, and those schedules are set by the state archivist within the Secretary of State's office. And so I put in an example here. You can go online to the Secretary of State's Archives Division, and you can see schedules that apply to all agencies, and then just sort of apply generally to different sorts of things. So SOS, Secretary of State's office, will say, communications generally, like which includes all emails and stuff, have to be retained for X period of time. But so for the Public Health Advisory Board, meeting records, minutes, et cetera, have to be retained for 5 years, and then they have to be transferred to state archives after 5 years. You retain all other records for 10 years, and then you can destroy them without sending them to the archives office. If you have public records in your possession that you haven't destroyed in accordance with the public records retention laws, then you have to disclose them, right? So you can't, if someone submits a public records request and says, I want board meeting records, or no, I don't know what would, board emails from 11 years ago, and you didn't destroy those emails after 10 years, even though you could, then you would have to cough up any records that you had. Next slide. So you should think about how you're going to retain things, right? If you have a system that automatically deletes emails after a certain period of time, you need to make sure that automatic deletion is consistent with whatever the retention period is. If you only have to keep emails for 30 days and they drop off, then that's fine. But there are probably some substantive things that you have to, that like fall into some other category that you might need to retain for longer. So, like I personally create Outlook folders and drag things into those and then retain them that way. You can print them and put them in a physical file. Again, text messages, social media posts and things take a little bit more thought to save them. And so again, maybe you need to send text messages, to your email and then print them out or something like that. So you just need to think through those things. Next slide. Yeah, so Sarah, I see Sarah present just put in a chat that I can see. So if there's an email to all board members, does every board member have to keep it? I mean, theoretically, yes, right? Because you don't, because you don't know who else. I mean, unless it was clear that, David Hart had the duty to keep all the board emails, you don't know who's doing what, so you should keep them. So you should retain them. And again, knowingly destroying public records without authorization is a Class A misdemeanor. And this is also, sort of a big no-no and problem if there is litigation where there's been a litigation hold and then records are not available for discovery because they haven't been retained properly. Next slide. Okay, so before I go on to ethics, any question? I don't know how I'm doing for time. Any questions about public records or records retention? David?
Shannon, so would a subcommittee member's email to a non-committee member relating to the subcommittee's business, that would be a public record. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. It wouldn't, right, so the subcommittee member's email, I guess the person that received it, wouldn't necessarily be subject to the public records law, but the person that sent it, yeah.
Or received it.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Okay.
Can I jump in just to be clear on emails? Because I foresee, these are work intensive projects where there's going to be sharing of documents and a fair amount of emails, I would imagine. So I'm trying to understand, is it just the retention of emails, making sure that we have a folder that maintains all the advisory board subcommittee emails that come through our inbox, just have that in one place? Or is there more involved in some cases with regard to the public?
I think if you're doing that, then you're safe, right? And it should be the emails and then any attachments as well. If you have records that are existing outside of emails, right, you would want to make sure that you're retaining that information as well. That doesn't mean, like, if you're going out on the web and looking at something and not downloading a copy or printing something off a website, then you don't have to document that you went and looked at that website. But if you download it on your computer as study to review for purposes of the board's business, then you need to make sure that you're keeping that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I have a quick question, Shannon, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I've, as a government employee, I've had records requests, and I have staff in my legal department who help go through my email and find what is being requested. This may be a question for Andre, but for this board, if there was a public records request, is there staff support to help with this? And how, I'm just trying to make sure we can all prepare to be able to easily find the information if and when it is asked for.
So we do have public records staff here at OHA. So if there was a request for emails that included me or any other OHA staff, then we would be able to find those. But if you're going to email other board members, which you probably shouldn't be anyway, then I would just keep a separate, I would just keep a separate folder for those communications. And there shouldn't be many, right? Most of the business between the board is going to be done at meetings. And any emails that you'll be receiving will be coming from OHA staff. So there shouldn't really be too many emails between board members because then we would be violating the public meeting law. So I would just, I would just keep those in a separate folder, and I wouldn't worry too much about the volume. There shouldn't be too much volume that wouldn't be found through research from OHA records.
But I think, just real quickly, but I don't, right? I mean, we're not going to have state staff, I think, that's going to go through, your private computer, for example, and get stuff like, so I think you are, what would likely happen, that I've seen happen in one other circumstance, is that OHA will communicate to board members, we've gotten this public records request, so if you have any emails, other documents that are responsive to this, then you need to send those to us. And so you would be responsible for searching for those and sending them.
So I'm still a little confused about the detail work here. So if I'm wanting to send on a subcommittee level where there's lots of information to compile, if I have a singular bit of information, a study or a document that I want to share with the subcommittee or anyone in the subcommittee, but not the entire advisory board, do I need to go through the middleman of the OHA to get to the subcommittee or not?
You don't need to go to the middle person. I mean, is this a question about whether or not you can have that communication?
Yeah,
versus what you have to retain? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I know we have to retain all the emails, and that's not a problem. Just create a folder and maintain all business, right? But I hear Andre saying that there shouldn't be many emails. And in my mind, I'm thinking about all the work ahead of specifically the training committee. And I'm also thinking of the science committee that's up and running, and all the information that is being compiled and sorted out at the subcommittee level. I'm not sure that is just a few emails.
Yeah, again, I think that if people have these, Andre, if people have these sort of specific questions, why don't you send them to Andre, and let's see if we can get some further guidance to sort this out, rather than me trying to answer on the fly.
As you're sorting this out at OHA, I would just like to make one distinction. In contrast to other appointed boards or positions, this group is serving two functions. On the one hand, we're an advisory board that's accountable to the public. And on the other hand, we are very clearly tasked as a working group. And so we have to be able to do the work in between meetings. And if we can't do that, I'm not sure how we can fill our legislative mandate.
Is there a way OHA can develop or create email groups for us as a board, as well as for our subcommittees, of which, Andre, you and Nick are included, right? So these are email threads on record, but we can easily communicate with each other in real time.
Is that the solution? I've been subject to public records requests and discovery requests so many times. I'm just going to make a suggestion, because there's a difference between public records maintenance and a recording. Your subject matter line, you just put in your subject matter line, Psilocybin committee, subcommittee, some acronym, and then it's always available for a search. It's really not rocket science. Just don't delete anything and make it findable with your subject matter line, and you're done.
I think the point of confusion, though, is whether you need to have a public notice to send an email with another member of a subcommittee, every time you want to just confer. I think that's where the confusion is coming from. I think everyone understands.
Right, and there shouldn't be any conferences between members. So here's a hypothetical for a subcommittee, research subcommittee. Todd has a homework assignment to go find literature associated with psilocybin and addiction. So Todd's going to go do that homework assignment, and he's going to find X amount of papers. Let's say he finds 5 papers and some other document, some kind of, someone else's work group document. what Todd should be doing then is bringing the list of those references or the actual documents themselves, any summary that he's written when he's reviewed them, and then those will now be materials for the next subcommittee meeting for discussion. So there shouldn't be any discussion between members outside of those meetings about the homework assignment or the information that needs to be found. Does that kind of make sense?
I think most people understand what you're saying. They're just saying that we're not going to get much work done that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's burdensome. That's the point of like public bodies and governing bodies.
But also, Andre, co-chairs have to plan between meetings. I don't think we can just assume that all planning will happen each meeting. Their time might not afford that. And co-chairs, I would suspect, do need time to communicate with one another and plan for each additional meeting.
Right, and we can have co-chair and agency planning discussions and meetings, and we can set those times to discuss agendas. So if there's more than one co-chair, that's fine, but that meeting will be with the agency just to discuss what will be the agenda for the next meeting.
I think an analogy would be if a judge was having a clerk, they were conferring on a legal issue, or a legislator was having an aide, they were discussing some research for the legislator. They wouldn't, schedule a public meeting for every
right, but they're not a public body. So, I mean, it is the sort of wonderful and difficult place that you find yourself in because you're a public body. And I think, Rachel, with your thought, I think that an email groups might help with sort of retaining public records, but that it doesn't sort of address the public meetings issue. But again, I think if people have specific questions about what is allowed under the public meetings law, again, send those to Andre, and we'll see if we can get some more specific answers, because it is important that the group does its work just in compliance with the laws that apply. Okay, I'm sure that I'm over time by now, so we'll run through ethics real quick. Right, so most of you probably know that there's the Oregon Government Ethics Law, a code of ethical conduct for public bodies in Oregon and public officials. There is the Oregon Government Ethics Commission that enforces the law. Next slide. So who the ethics law applies to, again, public officials, and you all having been appointed to a public body are public officials for purposes of the ethics law. Next slide. So the basic requirements are, right, you're not supposed to use your or attempt to use your official position to obtain financial gain or to avoid the detriment or to avoid financial detriment. And that prohibition applies both to board members' relatives, members of your household, even if they aren't relatives, and businesses that you or relatives or members of your household are associated with. And again, when you're thinking about how the ethics law applies, think, if it would I be getting this advantage if it weren't for my position with this particular board? Next slide. So really where this is going to come into play for you all is with conflicts of interest, right? So there are actual conflicts of interest where you take some action, make a decision that is going to benefit you or someone close to you financially. And then there's a potential conflict of interest where it's not that you necessarily are going to get this benefit, but it's possible. There are also a lot of times there can be a perception that there's a conflict of interest, and in fact, there's maybe not a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest. So it is important to pay attention to these definitions. It is also important to know because we have lots of boards and commissions in Oregon that work this way, right? That there are stakeholders who sit on boards and commissions. So if you are in, right, so we have the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, you know, can have individuals that are directly involved in the cannabis or alcohol industry on that board. So if you are sort of in a group that is represented by the board, that does not mean that there is necessarily an actual conflict of interest, right? So if you, along with lots of other people that are sort of in your same position, are going to benefit from a particular regulation, for example, that is not an actual conflict of interest for you, because it's not sort of a benefit that you are getting sort of individually. It applies to a whole group of people. Next slide, that might be it. Oh, no, declaring conflicts. So if you have an actual conflict of interest, you have to announce it publicly prior to taking any action, and then refrain from participating in that issue, sort of unless your vote is absolutely necessary, in which case you can vote but aren't supposed to participate in discussion. If it is a potential conflict of interest, then you just have to announce the potential conflict prior to taking action, but you can still be involved in discussions and the vote. And again, the conflicts of interest and any disclosures should be captured by the Oregon Health Authority in minutes or in a recording.
Yeah, and we have a form if you want to declare a conflict. So if you have one, just let me know, and we'll get you to that form.
Yeah, I think, is that it, Andre? Yeah. Any questions on the ethics part?
I do, Shannon. What's not included here in the definition of conflict of interest is like any other board that we might be a part of, right? It lists a person, a relative, or business. But as a board member, one that does not, you know, like an unpaid board seat, for example. I'll give you a concrete example. I'm a board member for New Leaf Project. It is a nonprofit BIPOC serving equity organization in the city of Portland. And that is a potential conflict of interest that I present at CPOT meetings, the Cannabis Policy Oversight Team for Portland, and mostly because CPOT does contribute in like decision-making to a degree on grants that the city might be offering, of which New Leaf could be a recipient. But like, I don't have any other, like, there's no remuneration or anything else associated with my responsibility on that board.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think just because those things are not necessarily called out, like you said, doesn't mean that there's not a conflict. And so I think, you know, folks should err on the side of disclosing things that they think are important for the public and others to know when they are engaged in discussions and voting.
Shannon, do the conflict of interest rules apply to non-board members who participate in subcommittee meetings?
I
know both subcommittees have invited folks to assist. So to what extent do these rules apply to those non-board member participants?
I think those non-board member participants haven't been appointed, and so they wouldn't be considered public officials for purposes of the ethics law. But I don't know, I don't feel totally confident in that answer.
Yeah, I'm also thinking if people are providing advice and information, wouldn't we want to know if there was a conflict of interest? If somebody, I just learned, for example, there are publicly traded mushroom companies investing in the future of psilocybin. If they were providing information, wouldn't we want to know about that if someone owns stock in that type of company?
Yeah, you might, though I don't think that that's what the ethics law covers, right? Because they're not going to be voting or having a sort of financial interest in, or potential financial interest in a vote. So I don't think it would apply. I certainly think that, it's useful for everyone to understand where people are coming from. And it may be that the board wants to, think about sort of its own rules of engagement and ask people involved in subcommittees for them to disclose sort of any conflicts, like you would, if you're a speaker at certain conferences, right? They often have you do conflict forms. I think that's something that the board could think about.
Or publications, you disclose your conflicts.
Yeah, right.
So just to be clear, and I speak on behalf of myself, and I think for others on the board, there are folks here, including myself, who are working on projects in the field, and that's where some of our expertise comes from. So I'm just wanting to get real clear about what disclosure means. It sounds like there's a form. I'd like to learn more about that. Is there more to disclosure? Just to be clear on that, it's new territory for me.
Yeah, I think Andre can get some more information out about that. Because I do think, right, you were appointed, some people were appointed to this board because of their particular background and expertise, with what's going to be this newly regulated field. And so there are going to be situations where there are things that are at least going to appear to some folks like they are conflicts of interest, and that people are sort of acting in their own self-interest versus, sort of some greater good, perhaps. So we can get some additional information out about that.
On FDA advisory boards, waivers you can have a waiver for a conflict if the expertise is needed, but only after full disclosure.
Yeah, it seems important, this idea of, working toward the benefit of the program as a whole, and that benefits all training programs. And you are also working with the training program. That's my example. So as opposed to specifics where you're carving out something for your specific project, I can see where that's obviously a conflict of interest. So I'd like to kind of continue to learn and clarify on that level.
I would say you can just approach me privately by email or phone call if you have a potential or the appearance of a conflict of interest. And really, I'll be looking if there's any pecuniary gain to you, and that would be dependent upon a board decision. So, it's not going to be, this is an example it's kind of moot, but let's say the agency was look into a contract for an IT contract for tracking psilocybin products, which we don't have to worry about because we have OLCC system. And you held some sort of financial interest in that company that might get that contract. That's something that you would have to disclose. And, if there was a vote, then you might have to recuse yourself from voting for, whether we would recommend OHA enter into a contract with that company. So things like that is what the agency is really going to be worried about. But, if you have questions, if it doesn't feel right to you, or if you feel that there might be an appearance of impropriety or conflict of interest, just let me know and we'll talk it out. And I can always give Shannon a call. And then we can disclose that. There's a OHA form for disclosure of conflict of interest. And just because there is a conflict of interest doesn't mean that you're going to be excluded necessarily.
Makes sense.
Okay, so thank you very much, Shannon. Always a complicated topic. So any questions, just let me know. And we'll keep moving forward here. Kevin, I see you have your hand up. Do you have a question? I think you might just have that hand up for. Okay, so we're going to jump into our subcommittee reports and discussions. What I have here listed is training and research. I know we talked about the formation of the equity subcommittee last meeting too. But since there was no equity subcommittee meeting in the past month, we'll have those discussions first and the next subcommittee discussion after we get the report out and discussions from training and research. So with that, I will turn it over to, let's see, we'll start with training. I'll turn it over to Tom.
Right on. Thank you. Great to be back with everyone. We did indeed have our first subcommittee meeting regarding the training program project. It was good, obviously preliminary, overviewing top level concerns and projects. I think I mentioned last time around with the full group that there's a bit of a compressed timeline to get recommendations together and ultimately to get programs on the ground in much earlier than the licensing comes on board in 2023. So we're really reverse engineering from 2023 so that we have licensed practitioners ready for that date. And so I'll spare you the details of the timeline. During the subcommittee, we went through kind of the different transition points on that timeline. But the main takeaway is that it would be really great to have comprehensive recommendations for the full board as well as ultimately the OHA by this summer, which is certainly a tall order, but I think we can organize ourselves and kind of define these different sub-projects that are involved in getting those recommendations together so that we can indeed have training programs on the ground in the not too distant future. I'm hoping even potentially in the fall or by the end of this year. So yeah, by all means, jump in with questions or thoughts. I'll provide a few kind of top level thoughts if I may. So I think, the first kind of top level thought is that we're not trying to create a government run training program. We're trying to create administrative rules and recommendations for independent training programs that are throughout the state of Oregon and provide a way for those to become approved and recognized by the OHA, provide oversight, provide accountability, quality control, all that kind of good stuff. So a slice of that is, of course, developing ideas around the program, the curriculum of the program, and kind of what we need to teach. But I think we all kind of concluded that that's only a slice of the pie. The bigger picture, is what it takes to really put these programs on the ground. And one way to kind of think about this, and might be helpful to other subcommittees as well, is if you're a professional person, like if you're a nurse or a doctor or psychologist, counselor, you have OARs, and it's probably worth reading them because you get a real good sense of like all the aspects of what goes into your profession being kind of codified. And so with training, obviously there'll be a big old section on psilocybin services, the entire program in the OARs, and then under that there'll be a section on training programs, and then there'll be subsections under the training program as to kind of what areas we need to look at and define. And I think that's the work we need to do as a subcommittee first and foremost, is kind of define those subsections under the training program OARs and kind of figure out what rules and regulations we have to put in place. So part of that's the curriculum and what are we wanting to teach potential students, although I think there's really good information out there around and consensus around what the important aspects of training are in terms of curriculum. But we also want to look at program administration, personnel, the requirements of educators, training program directors. We want to look at any kind of rules around enrolling students, standardizing applications, enrollment requirements, the general structure of programs, the length of the programs, the direct hours versus how they're spread over time. Didactic versus experiential training, practicum, mentorship overlay potentially, online versus offline. I know I'm throwing a lot out there, but just this isn't meant to be committed to memory, but this is the kind of stuff I think the subcommittee is going to have to sort out and kind of put expertise on each angle and organize. The online training versus offline is important. Are we looking at synchronous or asynchronous training? How are trainees evaluated? I think that's really important. Like, what are the completion requirements and how do we evaluate trainees? Because again, the training programs are really where we have to ensure competency throughout this statewide program. Of course, there's also a facilitator exam that will come after completion of a training program, which is another filter, but we have to ensure that we're moving really competent facilitators through and to become professionals in the statewide framework. Quality control, things like that. So we've talked a bit about all that. We've got to get into really organizing those sub-projects in the next meeting and getting to work within those sub-projects. We talked about getting some outside support. What are the resources out there available to us? And there's quite a bit of good information out there that we can organize and work with. And I think that's the general gist of the first meeting and the direction we're headed. Anyone from the subcommittee want to add anything to that? Or, I'm not sure what the format is for sharing in this from the subcommittee perspective, if this opens up into discussion or not. I'll leave that to Andre. Those are some of my thoughts.
Well, thanks, Tom. I would say the subcommittee chairs in these report outs can kind of acknowledge people that have questions or comments, or people can jump in. I think we have a very considerate and polite group here, so I don't think we're going to talk over each other. So I'll try to keep it as informal as possible.
Okay. So we got our work cut out for us to get some form to these recommendations by this summer. So we're going to be meeting frequently. I think the more the better.
I have a question, Tom. This is Sarah, President Health Officer. I was not here at the first board meeting, and thus I did not join in either of the subcommittees. Can you just briefly tell me who's on the subcommittee? And I'm looking to see if there are gaps that I could potentially fill on either of these so far versus one later.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kim Golitz is on there, Stephanie Bars, Angela Carter. Did I miss someone? And myself. So I think that's it. And we're discussing bringing in a couple members, probably non-voting members, and we're ironing out how all that works. But there's some, I had mentioned in the subcommittee meeting, I think I might have mentioned it in the previous full meeting, that this has been on my horizon for a while, that this bottleneck in regards to training would be a kind of first order of business. So I had been working with some leaders in the field, even back during the campaign and up to now, kind of thinking through some of this stuff. So we're going to bring in a representative from that group to kind of forward some of our thoughts and findings for the subcommittee to consider. And then Beel Abadi, who is a expert in the field, was brought up as a potential committee member. So we'll have some outside expertise. And I think we'll need it. We've got a lot of work to do. Any other questions, thoughts about the training subcommittee?
It's David, and it kind of relates to my earlier questions about conflicts of interest and trying to clarify the role of outside members being invited. It's my impression that subcommittees are free to invite anybody they want to provide them with information. I personally think they need to disclose any conflicts of interest, but these would not be voting members. They would just be people providing expertise and information. Am I correct about that? Subcommittees
my
can
understanding.
create new, and this is maybe to Andre, subcommittees can't invite new members to be voting members of their subcommittee, can they?
Well, I mean, I'll leave that to the discretion of those subcommittee chairs on how they want to bring forth recommendations to the full group. If the subcommittee wants to have a majority vote on, let's say, we're going to recommend that facilitators have at least 100 hours of practicum before they could get a license. You know, if the subcommittee's chair wants to say, hey, this is my subcommittee, and the co-chair is going to say, we're going to bring this recommendation forward, thanks for your advice, that's fine. Or if they want the subcommittee members to say, hey, you know, let's have a vote to see if we want to bring this recommendation forward to the group, I think there's flexibility in that. It's really ultimately the vote from the advisory committee to the agency that's really going to matter, in my opinion. Because, you know, subcommittee could bring a recommendation and the rest of the board doesn't like it, and I think the rest of the board has the weight to say, nah, OHA, we don't recommend that. We go with the subcommittee's recommendation here. So I think there's some flexibility with how subcommittee chairs want to bring recommendations forward to the board, if they want to bring them to a vote first, or if they just want to say, thanks for your input and we're going to look for some consensus, or we'll make that decision. You know, I think that there's not a lot of, you know, rules for subcommittees. So I think that however you guys want to do it is fine.
That's something we could vote on as a group if we chose to, you know.
Sure, I need to bring those bylaws back, which I will do for next session. I didn't want to bore everybody with bylaws, but we could include how subcommittees want to bring forth recommendations and whether they vote on it or not. We can include that in the bylaws.
David is referring specifically to adding, you know, voting members to a subcommittee. And there is something about that in the bylaws, that a member of a subcommittee would have to be voted on by the entire board. So I think that's what David was trying to clarify.
Yeah, that's correct. It's not whether the subcommittee has to vote to bring a recommendation, but the role of invited member, non-board members who are invited to participate. To what extent do they participate in the decision-making of the subcommittee?
Yeah, we talked about kind of different levels of engagement with subcommittee outside help, basically, you know, whether they're coming in to do a one-off presentation, or if this is a member that's going to be sitting in with the discussions each week or bi-weekly, whenever the subcommittee meets. And if they are kind of part of the mix, are they voting members? You know, my feeling is that I don't think they need to be voting members. I think that there are certain folks that are really helpful to have in discussions. And I think the objective is to get consensus anyways. And I don't know that we need to complicate it with new voting members. But yeah.
And Mason, you're right. The draft bylaws at this point do say creation of subcommittees needs approval by the advisory board, and then appointments to subcommittees may be nominated by any member and then requires approval by the full board. So that's what's in the bylaw right now.
And I like.
Okay, but meetings have happened. Meetings have happened for both of those committees before voting on members.
Well, we voted on members for the core subcommittee out of the advisory board. What we're talking about is adding members and adding,
correct.
Well, not members per se, but recruiting help essentially. Do we need to vote on folks coming into a subcommittee, even if it's on a revolving basis, if they're not voting members? I guess that's my question. Does that need to come to the full advisory board to vote on? I kind of would hope not.
I would say then they're invited speakers, and then they're not actually formal members of the subcommittee. So if they're just invited speakers, then they're not going to have a vote. And I think that's fine.
Yeah, okay.
I do like David's idea of having some kind of protocol for people, whether they're guests or not, for disclosing conflicts, and that maybe we could just flag that for further discussion later.
Yeah, I think with the training committee, it's super obvious. The reason they're coming in to talk is to talk about their program. So it's obviously what they're sharing is how they did this, and maybe this can be helpful to the Oregon model.
Oh yeah, I'm not concerned about that committee specifically by any means.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
Can we clarify real quick? Do subcommittee members, right, the official rosters of these subcommittees, excluding advisory board members, need to be approved by the board?
If we're going to go with the draft bylaws, then yes, at this time.
Okay.
So do I, I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm still getting clear. So do I or do I not need to name the subcommittee additions and have it voted on or run through the advisory board? Considering that
Yeah, I would say if there's any
presenters and not official subcommittee members.
I think, whether what their status is going to be determined, nominated by you, and then the board can vote on that, but whether you want to say, look, they're just going to be invited speakers, that's fine. You don't need our approval for that. But what I think we could probably do is outside of the advisory board members, you can send me a list of additional actual committee members that would be official members. That would be a meeting document and material. We could present the list to the board, and the subcommittee chair can just say, hey, this is Dr. X. They work at this place. They have the expertise here. I want them on the committee. This is Dr. So-and-so. They work here. Just kind of like a brief intro of who else you want to add. And then the board will just say, yeah, that seems fine. Or no, I really have some concerns about this person, which I don't really see us doing that. But I think that's probably the best process at this point for non-advisory members that want to be on a subcommittee. Just let's present the list of names, do a quick run through of who you want to add. And then we can say as a board, yeah, that seems fine. Or no, I really have concerns about this particular person. See, Kim, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So does that mean that adding more people to a subcommittee happens through the subcommittee chair only, or does that mean other people on the subcommittee can also bring on more members?
Any advisory board member can nominate someone else to be on a subcommittee.
Great, thank you.
Can I just
Would it
chime
be
in?
possible, Andre, to compile the names and maybe short bios of all those nominated per each subcommittee, such that we can look at it and read it and then approve, as opposed to each chair or co-chair presenting the name, presenting the bio, rationale, just to make it more streamlined and efficient?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think what I'm aiming for is a lot of deference to subcommittee chairs on how they want to form their subcommittees and who they want their members to be. And then, of course, the board would have to approve it. But I'm really looking at the subcommittee chairs with, like, it's your subcommittee. We can give you a lot of deference and leeway with how you want to run it. But yeah, let's just do the minimum of, well, let's look at the list. Is there anyone that stands out that needs to have some questions about? If so, then we can have that discussion in the open and then just approve the list or not.
Just as a general comment, I think we should be thoughtful about how we do this. I mean, with the training program subcommittee, there are so many experts, so many people that we don't want to be sprawling. I think we need a tight group of folks and actually bring in presenters for specific points. You know what I mean? Like, as the committee work evolves, there's going to be very particular things that we need expertise exactly on this, rather than kind of the generalists out there that know a lot, but I think the existing subcommittee knows a lot and can get a lot done before we need to rely on lots of people outside the committee.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Any more questions for Tom or the training subcommittee? All right, and you can always nominate yourself to be on a particular subcommittee too. Okay, I'll turn it over to Todd if you want to give a report on the research subcommittee. I think this is the subcommittee that's done the most amount of legwork so far. And you're still on mute.
Can everyone see my screen? All right, so I did some quick shuffling in response to the previous conversation here. This is just a summary of our first thing. I've listed actually the people that are currently on the subcommittee. All were approved at the last advisory board meeting, with the exception of Christopher Stouffer, who I'll talk about in a minute. We had our first meeting on April 14th, where we strategized on how we're going to meet the June 30th deadline for Measure 109, Section 11, mandating a review of evidence to be presented to the OHA, which they can subsequently present to the public by the end of July. At that meeting, we achieved initial consensus regarding some key questions for the evidence review. We drafted a few questions that we'll present in a minute. We made a decision that we will limit the evidence review strictly to psilocybin rather than open it up to other psychedelics that have a lot of literature around them. We decided to prioritize systematic reviews for the evidence review. And the goal is really just a scoping review. This isn't going to be a formal systematic review with meta-analyses, something that will be able to inform a summary that can be digestible and inform our work. We also agreed to identify an expert to provide input on our methodology. The research subcommittee invited Dr. Christopher Stouffer, or nominated him to join the research subcommittee. So I'll just pause here, and perhaps we can take a vote on this so we can make him official. Dr. Stouffer is an addiction psychiatrist who moved to Oregon Health and Science University from UCSF last year. Oregon was so lucky to recruit him. He, to my knowledge, is the only one in Oregon who's actually had experience conducting trials in psychedelic research. He's studied oxytocin, he studied MDMA, as well as psilocybin for a variety of conditions while at UCSF, and is moving part of that research to Oregon. He's presented at various psychedelic conferences, both nationally and internationally. And the research subcommittee felt strongly that we need his input. Can I put that to a vote?
Let's make a motion. So I'll make a motion to vote for Dr. Stouffer as the research subcommittee member. Can I get a second motion?
Second.
Thank you. Let's just do it this way. All those opposed to Dr. Stouffer being on the research subcommittee, please say so. All right, hearing no opposition, Dr. Stouffer is now an official member of the research subcommittee. Welcome, Dr. Stouffer.
All right, thank you. The committee also agreed to meet every 2 weeks instead of every 4 weeks, and our next meeting is scheduled for tomorrow. You're all welcome. We've also made a little bit of headway with our primary task of preliminary evidence gathering. So far, we've identified 28 systematic reviews in the literature regarding psilocybin and a variety of conditions. We've identified, in addition to that, 32 additional papers that inform safety, efficacy, and dosing. The next task is to really synthesize all of this, which is quite a job. We've also invited the Pacific Northwest Evidence-Based Practice Center Director, Dr. Roger Chow, to attend our next meeting tomorrow. The center has volunteered their expertise and hopefully maybe even a bit of staff time to help us provide structure, organization, and collation around our evidence review. So I'm very excited about this. This has so far been an activity of the research subcommittee. Is this something that we need to vote on, Andre or others, as an advisor group? At this point in time, their role is purely assisting.
No, I think that's just something that you would put on the agenda as a topic.
Okay.
If they're going to come and present or provide any information, then just put it on the agenda.
Great. And then thank you, Dr. Euling, who drafted a Gantt chart to get us organized and on a timeline. It's very ambitious. The first deadline is for the Psilocybin Advisory Board, this board, to review and make an initial recommendation on our proposed key questions. We'll spend the next month conducting the literature review and identifying some expert support. By the end of May, the idea is to be able to synthesize some of this into draft sections that will be provided to the editor. Drafts will be circulated subsequently over the next month, with final edits due to the editor in the fourth week of June, and presentation to the full board at the end of June, with the final document due on June 30th to OHA for review. This is breathtakingly fast. Any comments on this?
Yeah, Jesse Euling here. I'm curious if it's possible to involve a professional editor once our subsections are drafted and submitted to aid in the expedition of our writing and polishing. Is that acceptable? And if so, would it go through the same conflict of interest and appointment procedures?
I think if you're asking to bring in some resources to help the board, I think that's fine. It's not going to require, I don't think it should require a vote. Unfortunately, I think, the timing of this is poor, because then we eventually will have staff that could have done this work and this editing work anyway. But we're not going to get staff on before this amount of staff on to do this type of work before June. So I think inviting people that want to do this, based on their own time and charity, then that's fine.
Thanks.
Right at this point in time, that task falls to the research subcommittee members, and I share Dr. Euling's hope that we can gather some additional support for this, and that will be a topic of conversation during our subcommittee meeting tomorrow. So now I'd like to spend whatever remaining time is designated for the research subcommittee. The next two slides are our draft key questions. I tried to sort of distill down the discussion. Much of this is in the minutes, public minutes from that meeting. And I'd like to get guidance from the rest of the advisory board on whether or not this is on the right track. I'll just skip ahead quickly so you know how many. There are 9 right now key questions. That's considered, again, breathtakingly ambitious for something on this timeline. So the more we can consolidate, I would plead for insights about how to consolidate this rather than how to expand it. But also, request any input on anything we've missed. So the first draft key question is, what are the benefits of psilocybin-assisted therapy in persons seeking treatment for specific conditions in terms of improving the condition's symptoms and improving quality of life for depression, anxiety, or PTSD, alcohol use disorder, tobacco use disorder, other drug use disorders, and end of life and palliative care. The second key question, which is closely related, but I wasn't sure it doesn't really fit under the biomedical disease model. What are the benefits of psilocybin-assisted therapy in healthy persons who are being treated to improve wellness, promotion, spiritual growth? The third draft key question is, how do the benefits of psilocybin differ by population subgroup? And fourth, are there differing benefits by dosing strategy? For example, formulation or actual dose. And then fifth, what are the provider patient risk assessment tools that can identify persons likely to benefit from psilocybin-assisted therapy? One could argue that questions 2 through 5 are all sub-questions of efficacy and safety. So I'll leave that to the board. Key question 6, what are the potential risks of psilocybin-assisted therapy? And these roughly track with the potential benefits by conditions potentially. But the subcommittee raised a variety of really interesting things. What are the interpersonal risks between therapist and person being treated? Medical, psychological, toxicity profile, et cetera here. Again, perhaps some of this can be condensed and consolidated. And then number 7, what are the relative benefits of harm and harms of psilocybin sources, including mushroom cultivation and consumption? This is getting at the production of products. And then number 8, best practices for psilocybin production. And number 9, best practices for dose control. So also one could argue that the items 7 through 9 may be contextual questions. There may or may not be randomized trials in these 3, but there's still information in the literature that needs to be synthesized. So I'll stop talking there and start taking notes on your input. Shall I go back to the first one?
Well, yeah, hey, it's David. And thank you. That was very comprehensive. And there's some interesting issues raised. I have a little concern about number 2. And I am not ruling out that psilocybin-assisted therapy can lead to spiritual growth. I'm just not sure it's in the purview of this task that we have at hand. I don't know how spiritual growth is measured. I'm a little uncomfortable with governmental advisory boards becoming involved in making spiritual growth advisory opinions of any sorts, or I'm not sure how research, you can quantify that. So that of what you just laid out, it all looked great. I don't want to minimize the significance of wellness, health, but I'm just a little uncomfortable with spiritual growth as being a metric.
I think it should go as
I will
far
say
as
109 frames exactly this, the opportunity for adults in Oregon to use psilocybin for personal and spiritual growth. So I do think we need to consider it and discuss what that means, especially through a decolonized and, ethnocentric lens. Spiritual healing is medical healing as well. So we're going to be confronted with a lot of intersectionality in this process here. This is a plant medicine. This is considered a spirit plant, psilocybin mushroom. And we're talking about, a substance within that mushroom, but how it's been used throughout time has been for spiritual purposes that, again, is a component to mental and physical healing. So I don't think we're going to get away from that. And I don't think we should. And I think it's going to be our duty to make sure that we protect the conversation around an adult's pursuit of spiritual healing and growth.
No doubt. I'm just questioning the research component. That's all.
I think that we should.
I would just say to that, one of the comments that I would make is that, this is an exploratory survey. I don't know off the top of my head what folks out there are using to measure, spiritual growth. I suspect that there are instruments that exist that folks use to measure that. Or similar, types of outcomes. And so part of the goal to address key question number 2 will be to see what is out there and collect it and form an opinion about it.
Exactly right.
I'll just chime in with a tidbit from the evidence that we've gained so far. And actually, maybe spiritual growth isn't the correct term. From the scientific literature that we've seen so far, maybe a better term is mystical experience. Roland Griffith's classic 2006 randomized trial. I don't want to misspeak, actually, so I'm not gonna go any further on that. But there were in that study and subsequent studies measures of mystical experience that have subsequently, been used in other studies.
And just to add to that, and speaking generally here, the general finding is that the more intense the mystical experience as captured by these specific measures that are in the Johns Hopkins research, et cetera, are correlated with the outcomes, with the good outcomes in general. And I'm sure Todd will break that down in detail. But I think that's partly what we're talking about here. And I think it is useful to use the scientific language, mystical type experience as correlated with positive outcomes, et cetera. And to Rachel's point, I think and I don't know if this is in the science and research category, but I think the historical perspective is important. I think there's a way to do that without making subjective conjectures about spirituality. I think that's what the worry is here, is that we start going off on our own kind of thoughts about what psilocybin can do. Certainly don't want to do that, but we don't want to miss any of the important aspects of psilocybin use. And, that goes beyond just the medical model and from a historical perspective. And
I think Tom just made a similar point, I think, in the chat. I think we will look to those sorts of sources of information as well, more prototypically quantitative, and then more sort of qualitative, historical, anthropological, just to get as wide a scope and understanding of the potential benefits as possible.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and say, I think maybe the word spiritual is kind of the issue here. And I think what we're getting at is kind of a holistic approach to well-being that's more than just physical health and kind of compartmentalized mental health. So maybe we need to reframe the question, but I think it's something getting at that is pretty important.
Yeah, and resident endocrinologist here. The endocannabinoid system and greater endocannabinoid dome is being understood as the psychosocial spiritual model of medicine. So there is a lot to explore throughout that spiritual lens. And I don't think we should avoid the word spiritual here.
Sure.
I think we've avoided that term for far too long. Number one. Number two, I would add two things to number one, and that is racial trauma. Right? We have anxiety and PTSD, but I think we need to call out specifically racial trauma. And also, there's evidence that psilocybin can be used to treat other conditions, not just substance use disorders, right? Chronic pain, headaches, immunological disorders, neurodegenerative disorders. So, I think from a research perspective, we should be casting a wider net than that is listed here. Who knows what we're going to discover? But we want to be able to make sure that we have the right KPIs and parameters in place such that we can collect that quote unquote other information.
Yeah.
Because I want to recognize Steph and then Sarah, who've had their hands raised for a little bit. And then Tom, we'll get back to you after Steph and Sarah.
Draft question 6. If the medical point, the bullet B, is including medication interactions, people who are currently taking psychotropic medications, SSRIs or SNRIs, and what research has been done showing that whether they're serotonergic or not, people are not sure what to do, and be very curious to see what research is out there about other medications interacting potentially with psilocybin.
Yes, that's going to be included in the sort of medical risks, essentially.
Thanks.
Just to skip ahead, I think, number 6, medical risk, and perhaps toxicity profile.
So it seems like this is an interesting conversation for a lot of people. So I'll just kind of modulate the conversation. So I got Sarah, Mason, and then Barb, and then Tom, if you want to jump in after those comments.
Yeah, I had just a couple of comments building on some of the things that people have said already. Similar to what Steph just brought up, I wonder if number 5 would want to be expanded. Are there risk assessment tools that would identify people that would have potential harms in addition to the benefits? I reiterate that number 2 is a really important question that I think that we should have on there. We have a really unique position to be able to be a leader in bringing together all sorts of therapies from different cultures and different times around the world, and we need to do it really thoughtfully. We're a body that other states and other countries even potentially are going to be looking at and how we do this. So I wonder if it's an add-on question of what language is most acceptable in the scientific community and in various other therapeutic communities. So what are the benefits for the health promotion wellness, but also what are the most appropriate ways to address this aspect? I don't know if that needs to be another separate question in the research or not. And then third, if you would go to the next slide for me, please. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about number 7. And does that include like potential unintended consequences of the industry of cultivation, like environmental impacts and that sort of thing? Or is that something?
This is getting at the legislation allows for both pharmaceutical style psilocybin administration if it's available, and as well as mushrooms. And yet, I'll just let Dr. Ewing answer the rest of this. The mushroom is which type of mushrooms, et cetera. That's where it gets really complicated really quickly. So, Jesse, you want to talk?
Thank you. Yeah, there are actually very many ways to produce psilocybin or extract it from live organisms. So you could, for example, grow whole mushrooms in a cultivation setting. You could extract psilocybin from those mushrooms and use an extracted product. Psilocybin is also being explored in a production capacity synthetically in heterologously expressed genes like cell culture using model organisms like E. coli or yeast. And then also groups are synthetically producing psilocybin using chemical biosynthesis pathways. So there's a lot of potential sources for psilocybin, and we are definitely thinking about safety and occupational safety around, for example, mushroom cultivation versus cell culture. Those two scenarios look very different. So we're considering all of those things.
Jesse, you want to talk about some of the species differences in toxicity?
Sure, yeah. So there are actually over 200 psilocybin producing species in the genus Psilocybe. So fungi have all these fun names, and there are several genera that are unrelated that have the capability, the biosynthetic gene clusters, to produce psilocybin. So discerning which ones are actively being cultivated or should be targeted and what other bioactive molecules they make, risks associated with using, for example, whole mushroom products versus extractions. These are the kinds of questions that we're discussing. There's a lot of mushrooms that make psilocybin.
Sarah, how could we rephrase question 7 to be more streamlined?
Well, I think that maybe cultivation and consumption might be separate questions. Where cultivation, and be more specific about sort of the industrial and occupational aspects of it versus different toxicities of different mushrooms.
So maybe cultivation is part of question 8, and
yeah,
we want specific information about specific psilocybin sources in number 7 around consumption. Okay.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to recognize Mason and then Barb.
Thanks. Todd, could you go back to the previous slide, please? Just a quick comment about 1B. You might want to just expand that out to anxiety disorders, and then that would include PTSD and OCD and any other conditions under that umbrella of anxiety disorders. And I also agree with Dr. Knox about chronic pain being a very important addition to that list. And then also kind of following on what Dr. Present said, if you go back to 7 and 8, I think that...
Can I just, before you move on,
please, yeah.
Mason, can I ask about, one of the things I was debating was F, the end-of-life palliative care. It's kind of its own thing, but so far what we're seeing in the literature is most of the literature is talking about anxiety and depression related to end of life. Are those part of the same thing?
My inclination would be to leave it in. I think it's such an important thing that I think it merits its own category.
It could be advanced disease management, advanced illness.
Yeah, or life-threatening illness. Maybe something a little more general, maybe not end of life, maybe is not the best way to frame it. I think I agree with Steph there.
I don't want to pathologize end of life. I think this is the segue into the spiritual conversation as well.
Yeah,
it's not just relieving anxiety around end of life. It's something more than that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, end of life is mentioned, if you look in the chat, that Andre, I think it's actually mentioned in the official language, right?
Well, we could call it life-threatening illness, serious or life-threatening illness. I think that would encompass that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my take is end of life, and palliative care particularly tends to cover a lot of sort of terminal illness situations, and so I think the current phrasing covers a lot of the bases that folks are talking about.
But I agree. that this language is a bit stigmatizing, like terminal illness, end of life care. I think this is kind of what Tom was getting at. Those may not be the terms that we would choose to use. So
Doesn't palliative care also mean, I mean, we're dealing with folks who have had a challenging diagnosis, whether or not they recover or are in remission, et cetera. Just the feeling of having an existential challenge is what we're also getting at.
that may be a good solution. The next thing I wanted to comment on was that I think you might want to, just to take some things off your plate, number 8, I think could go to a separate subcommittee that we're probably going to form later today.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of suggest that we might think about moving on to that rather soon, because I'm a little concerned that we may not have enough time to establish these new subcommittees, which are going to have just as much work as the ones we're talking about today. And I'm really concerned about getting those up and running so they can get started on their work as well.
Thank you, Mason. That's actually my comment too, was more procedural. I know, Todd, you and your committee were asking for feedback from the whole group, but we have a number of other subcommittees that we still need to form. And this is exactly the comment I made when Nick sent out the draft agenda was, and it's almost 3 o'clock. We don't have much time left on our agenda. And I would be very nervous if we end today's meeting without forming some of these other subcommittees, or at least getting them started. So that's my comment, Andre.
Does the broader psilocybin advisory board give the subcommittee permission to take a final vote on revised questions at our meeting tomorrow?
I'll take that as a motion, and I'll second it.
Thank you.
So, Todd, do you want to repeat your question for just approval of the board?
Does the board
approve? I put that on you because I couldn't remember all of you.
You're assuming I can say the same thing twice.
Yeah.
Does the board give the research subcommittee permission to make a final vote on the precise wording of key questions at our next meeting?
Anyone opposed?
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. This has been incredibly helpful. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Todd. And then I do have a hand raised from Rachel still, I think.
Yes, I put it down. I would just like to make a nomination for the research subcommittee. And that is for Dr. Del Potter. And I would like to read you Del's esteemed bio. Del received his PhD in 1980 in medical anthropology from a joint program between the UC Berkeley Department of Anthropology and UCSF Medical School, specializing in psychiatric anthropology, ethnopsychopharmacology, and neuropharmacology. He also received postgraduate training in chemical engineering and clinical training at the San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute. Del conducted extensive postgraduate ethnographic research in Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. His research has been focused on the psychohistory and personality development of the shamanic practitioner, shamanic ceremony and ritual, and indigenous psychotherapeutic strategies. He also conducted research on the ethnopsychopharmacology and phytochemistry of shamanic pharmacopoeia, and created a database of indigenous psychoactive botanicals used by Richard Evans Schultes in a worldwide examination of psychedelic botanicals. As part of UC Berkeley's anthropological film series, Del filmed shamanic ceremony and ritual among Yanomami indigenous groups. Del is currently Chief Science Officer at Leaf Holdings, where he engineered Leaf Labs cannabis manufacturing facility, the first CGMP cannabis manufacturing facility in California. The facility employs fully automated extraction lines for highly purified pharmaceutical active principal cannabinoid and terpenoid compounds. During the process of implementation, he engineered proprietary and patented strategies for purification, color, and pesticide remediation. Del also managed Leaf Labs' transition to CGMP certification with the FDA. Lastly, Del is also currently Chief Science Officer and founder of Aya Biosciences, focused on the development of novel cannabis and psychedelic pharmaceuticals. AYA has a general approach of using cannabis formulations to address symptom and psychedelic compounds to address underlying cause in a multifaceted treatment strategy, and takes a traditional pharmaceutical approach of producing novel compounds with better safety profiles, less adverse side effects, and more targeted therapeutic efficacy. AYA just completed preclinical work on novel cannabis formulations addressing insomnia, pain relief, and appetite suppression. And AYA is also starting preclinical work with the Psychedelic Health Research Initiative at UCSD to examine a new psychedelic metabolite compound derived from a rare species of psychoactive mushroom that has a shorter onset and a shorter duration than psilocybin, and eliminates what many patients describe as the challenging psilocybin experience, during which patients experience fear, panic, and anxiety that may require pharmacological intervention or post-experience treatment. AYA also has analogs of 5-MeO DMT in early development that are orally active and are being
Thanks, Rachel. I think you went back on mute, so I don't know if I caught the last of it. But
how did I go on mute?
anyone
Okay.
Sorry.
I would just like to sum it up. I do believe Dr. Del Potter's background and technical experience and technical knowledge and current research would be invaluable to our group. And I want to call attention especially to his experience in ethnobotany and ethnopsychopharmacology, making him, in my opinion, a good equity research crossover. And that's it. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Rachel. We have some discussion on the nomination.
I appreciate the nomination, and I'm open to considering. I'm curious to what other people might think of. I don't know this person at all. I've never heard of him. It sounds like an amazing person that I'd love to meet and hear from. What do people think of his industry connections? Just a very quick Google search just now indicates he has some quite a few ties to vested interests in various pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, I'd like to know his conflicts of interest and kind of a full disclosure of that for sure.
I mean, one possibility would be to sort of have him speak at a research subcommittee meeting, and then sort of rediscuss based on that conversation.
I like that strategy in general.
Is
I
it
really
possible?
like.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I just want to reinforce that I think there is the need for complete disclosure of conflicts of interest, and this might be a good example of where we would have to hear that before we could vote on it.
Is it possible to systematically collect suggestions for the additions by implementing, for example, a suggested timeline and circulating bios so we can think about all of these together?
I like that idea, along with conflicts of interest.
And can we have different people serve as subject matter experts and not necessarily be part of the subcommittee? That could be kind of a medium too.
Yes. Yes, Paul, put to both of those. So what I can do, since I'm kind of figuring out the procedure here, is we could table the nomination of Dr. Potter, and then we can bring it back at the next full board meeting with his conflicts of interest disclosed, and if the research subcommittee would like to invite Dr. Potter to speak at the next research subcommittee meeting or one soon after that, then that is probably a good idea too.
I'd like to second Mason's comments about moving on to the establishment of the rest of the subcommittees, if it's possible.
I have one potential motion I forgot to mention with the training committee, that we would like to have Angela Carter be the co-chair. Does that need to go through the advisory board as a motion, or can I just appoint them?
Let's do it as a motion, and I'll second the motion. And then for this, we're voting whether Dr. Carter would be the co-chair of the training subcommittee. Any opposed? Hearing none. Congratulations, Dr. Carter. Okay, so I think we have consensus on how we would like to bring forward any additional subcommittee members that are not actually advisory board members. We also have a plan for bringing forward Dr. Potter's consideration and potentially speaking at a research subcommittee meeting. With that, it's 3:02. Let's do an 8-minute break. We're right on time. And then we will get into discussions on the equity subcommittee and then additional subcommittee work that Barb and Mason want to bring up. And then, you know, it's looking like we might not have time for public comment. So there are 10 extra minutes at the end if we still want to have a little bit more discussion on subcommittees, which I think we will have to since I designated about 30 minutes. So I'll see you guys back around 3:10. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you're able to get something to drink, use a bathroom. All right, next on the agenda is additional further subcommittee discussion. So I think what I would like to do, since we haven't had a meeting yet or some introductory conversations on equity other than who the co-chairs would be, I think I'll start with the equity subcommittee for the first 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to Mason and Barb for some suggestions on other subcommittees. That sounds good. Okay, so Dr. Knox or Dr. Carter, do you guys want to get us started on equity?
Sure. Yeah, so equity, as you all could imagine, is, well, as we know, it's a big deal. And Dr. Angela and I had to take great care in ensuring that we were amassing a group of individuals who represented diversity in as many ways as is possible. And a lot of that has to begin with relationship building. But we believe we have a healthy roster for our equity committee, and we'll be meeting in May. And when we convene again in May, we'll be happy to formally introduce the members for nomination and the board's approval.
Thanks, Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
Any other discussions on the equity subcommittee? Okay, I think procedurally what Nick will send out a doodle poll to Rachel and Angela and any other advisory board members would be interested in joining the equity subcommittee. I also think that Dr. Knox will provide me and Nick with a list of some invited speakers for that first meeting too, so we can get their
you have
availability.
Them. Yeah,
okay,
it would be
everyone
everyone on the list that we sent you.
Okay, well, we'll do that, and then we'll get that doodle poll out.
Okay, noted with gratitude.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Barb or Mason. You know, I guess you guys can tag team on how you guys want to start this conversation, and then I'll try to facilitate the discussion.
Well, Mason and I are both in agreement that we need a licensing subcommittee. According to the ballot measure, we have to license folks who manufacture psilocybin products, operate service centers, and our facilitators once they've been through that training program that Tom and his subcommittee design, and also license folks who can test psilocybin products. And so, for example, a psilocybin service center is not a healthcare facility under ORS 441, but then what is it? And I think one of our tasks as the licensing subcommittee will be to make recommendations to the Oregon Health Authority for a rulemaking process that determines exactly what a service center has to have. For example, is it one giant room? Is it individual rooms? Does there have to be a bathroom? You know, some of those details that are spelled out in some of the other ORS rules. For example, the ones I'm most familiar with is Division 71, because I went through the building of a hospice inpatient unit in Albany, and, you know, it gets down to the square footage of each room and the bathroom facilities. And again, I know this isn't a healthcare facility, but the licensing committee would be deciding what should be present in order to be licensed. So I'll shut up and let Mason talk. But I think there's lots of work to be done in the next year and a half or so.
I don't have anything else to add. That was beautifully stated, Barb. You know, regarding that committee, I think that's clear that that's very important.
For example, one of the things I was thinking is that because there's 4 different areas of licensure, this subcommittee might break into 4 subgroups of the subcommittee to work on each of those licensure aspects, depending on people's interest. And of course, we'd work very closely with the training subcommittee, you know, because in order to be licensed, they're going to have done the training program, completed the training program, and also taken the examination.
So how does this work? Do we move to create a subcommittee, or what?
I'd like to have discussion first. Could I comment on some of that? I think this is
Yeah,
really
please,
important.
go ahead.
I think kind of in general, I think we need to think through subcommittees sort of holistically, because the subcommittee structure becomes the work of the entire program. So I think it warrants some discussion as to like mapping out the subcommittees and then perhaps voting on them. I hear what's being said about the licensing committee. That's an avenue. I would potentially throw out another way of looking at it, which is separating those out. Like, I think the different licenses are so different and require different things. I think a products committee is its own thing. I think a service center committee might be its own thing. And I think the facilitator license could potentially be integrated with the licensing exam and possibly even the training committee, and just calling that one big facilitator license committee. And I think that if that were to happen, that facilitator committee would be laser focused on the training up front, because that's pressing, but then could grow into the next projects. So I really think, well, I mean, I'm open to discussion, but I think it's definitely worthy of discussion as to whether we want a licensing committee or to separate those out into specific committees. I think the products committee, for example, is very specific in terms of the material that's going to be addressed there. And yeah, so there's that. And then perhaps I would suggest discussion kind of on a holistic level as to what, if we could develop consensus before we vote as to what kind of committees we want to recommend to you.
I don't disagree with anything you just said, Tom.
Oh, good.
I generally agree that we could divide those up, perhaps into like facilities licensing and facilitator licensing. That might be a way to do it, facilities versus the people. But I do think that licensing should be separate from training. I think that subcommittee is going to have its hands full developing a curriculum and all of the different components there. So yes. I think facilitator licensing should be a separate subcommittee. There will be some interaction there, of course. And that needs to get up and going immediately. I don't think licensing can wait even until another meeting to get started. I mean, you know, I've done some of this work in the cannabis industry, it's going to take a lot of work, laser focused, and time is wasting.
I tend to agree that they're ultimately separate projects. My concern is I actually tried to blueprint just for my own thinking, like what could be a subcommittee structure and for the whole program. And I came up with 11 different subcommittees and then got feedback from my advisors that that's too many. So then I'm looking for ways, what integrates into what. So I agree with you that the facilitator training is just a big chunk of work and kind of ideally sits on its own. And I'm happy to certainly consider that. I'm also looking for ways to integrate stuff so that we don't have the sprawling subcommittee structure when we only have 17 of us. Now I know we can go outside of the advisory board itself to recruit help, and we will do that. So I guess that's open for discussion too. If you're willing, I'll just kind of throw out some of the ideas that I had. So the facilitator licensing committee, so the screening and matching committee. So this is this idea of creating a kind of centralized screening filter in which potential participants access the program and get digitally screened or flagged, or maybe moved into more intensive screening and then moved and matched to providers that have the competencies that meet the needs of that particular participant. So this is just a whole idea that we haven't really dove into yet, but there's this looming question of how we match potential clients, participants with providers that have the right kind of credentialing or competency to meet the needs of those particular. So there's a whole world of discussion in there. It might require its own subcommittee because I think there might be some digital build out there as well. So that came to mind. Certainly a service center committee. I think there's just standalone enough to work with there. Possibly a records and data committee that could roll into something else, but that's the area. The tracking system might be a committee. Products committee, product licensing. And then there's the licensing exam that could also get rolled into training. I think the training kind of naturally moves into what are we training on, and those learner outcomes become the basis of a licensing exam, although putting together, as I think Kim can tell you, putting together a professional exam is not a small thing. And then potentially a legal and business committee, like all the little questions that come up on the legal end, and that could get rolled into licensing as well, and kind of maybe each licensing committee has like a legal component, so maybe that's not a standalone, but I think we got to think about all those zoning and legal questions that are part of the licensing piece. Those are the areas that I came up with, so just as a discussion starter.
Can I just jump in? I would like to see licensing and training be separated. I think that the training is more about the clinical work and the contact with the folks. And the licensing, I think, speaks more to public safety and making sure that there are strict criteria for who can take on these different roles. And while there is some low overlap, that the licensing is a much more administrative kind of state government task as opposed to a clinical training task. And although they're overlapped, I think they're best separated.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Kim, what do you think about the exam and the training? Do you think those can be combined?
I'd like to see the exam be separate. I mean, one of the things when you talk about a licensure exam is, what is it going to test? It's clearly going to be related to training, but I don't know that the training committee comes up with is necessarily going to have everything in it that the safety issues that a licensure test would need to have. So again, they're related, but I think they're in different spheres.
I agree. So what does the group think about just how many committees? Is that a concern to you guys? Are you looking to integrate? And maybe Andre can speak to this.
I'd like to comment on that. You know, there's so much work to do in so little time. I think it's advantageous for us to divvy this up into committees. And if that's a lot of committees, I think all the better. You know, I say give people ownership over their own corners of this. We're trying to create an entire regulatory system. There's no way we're going to do it. You know, especially since we can't discuss anything outside of meetings. We need to have a lot of very specific focused meetings. It's the only way we're going to get this done. A lot of different highly specialized subcommittees.
Yeah, that was.
So I'm gonna be a little bit of a Debbie Downer. So we are resource limited because you are dealing with the state agency, and we don't have an army of public health workers. I am in the process of hiring a project manager that will help exponentially organize our work here. And then after we get our budget approved, hopefully in May or June with this legislative session, then hiring will speed up as well in the summer. So my recommendation would be, just for Nick and my sanity, and because we have to notice all of these subcommittee meetings as public meetings, is that we have maybe a handful, like 4 or 5 that are active right now. And then subcommittees can go dormant. You know, once the research subcommittee has finalized its first task, maybe it goes dormant for a few months and members join other subcommittees, and other subcommittees are formed to deal with specific subject areas around developing a comprehensive regulatory scheme. So I think that we can certainly, subcommittees can be flexible in what they take on. So, you know, if we have a training subcommittee, we could also talk about examinations in that subcommittee and just kind of delineate the time in which we discuss those aspects. So I don't have a problem with listing all the ideas of subcommittees now, but I think where we should get to a point today is probably on what's active now and what is the most immediate need to get started now. And I agree with Mason. I mean, we have about 18 months or so left, maybe a little bit more, and that's really not that. You know, that's not a lot of time in the kind of regulatory bureaucracy scheme of things to set something up that's really comprehensive like this. So yeah, I recognize that time is an issue, but resources are limited. So I think that I would like to maybe have 4 active committees now, and then in June, once the research committee has completed its first task, we can add on additional committees that would be active or have additional tasks.
There's no way we can only have 4 active subcommittees. There's no way. I mean, you have to, what's more important, actually getting this accomplished as the voters have mandated, or just sitting by and letting the time tick out and not meeting the deadlines that have been set out for us? I mean, I understand resources are limited, but that's what the subcommittees are for. They do the work. I you know, it's not like we have a huge administrative staff helping to run the subcommittees, but I think we should, you know, we formed 3 subcommittees with 0 discussion. We just formed them like that. And now there's a huge referendum on each subcommittee. I think we should get started on voting on subcommittees so that the work can begin.
I think I just wanted to say that I think that's ignoring the fact that if we have too many subcommittees, we're diluting our efforts and potentially getting less work done. So I don't think the way that you portrayed it is necessarily the way I would see it.
Well, you're entitled to a different opinion, of course.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I mean, I think that the subcommittees, once formed, get focused. You know, that people in this advisory board are interested in participating, and right now they're not, and we don't have time for that. To Mason's point, you know, I understood from feedback all around that having a sprawling number of a whole bunch of subcommittees up front might be tricky. We can stagger. But if you're saying 4 as opposed, meaning like 1 more than we have today, we have 3 up and running today. That's tough. I think that we need to get going. I think we need at least those licensing committees, maybe facilitator licensing committee, service center licensing committee, product center licensing committee. I mean, that's the core framework
Is
of
it
the
possible?
legislation, right?
Is it possible for committees to differentiate later? For example, if we started a licensing committee today, can it branch off into the divisions we're discussing later?
Yeah, but it would branch off right away because they're just entirely different subject matters in my mind.
But as a starting point to get meetings scheduled and have these discussions.
I want to be sure that we really can't do 3 more subcommittees. What is, I mean, really, is this really the boundary of this?
I'm letting everybody
board?
know. I'm gonna let everybody know now. We're not going to do 3 more. Just administratively, it's not possible right now.
I could manage that. I mean, why not? What's the challenge there?
I'm still hiring staff for the program. Nick and I are not official staff for psilocybin.
Why don't we have staff yet? It's been months.
We've got approval to hire 3 FTE. I'm in the process of interviewing 2. I think that the 3rd person is going to be working for one of the people I hire. So I think that person needs to say on who's hired. And then budgetarily, we don't have approval to hire the rest of the staff until after the legislature approves the governor's budget.
I have a lot of sympathy for Andre also working for the state. But why can't we have a kind of an omnibus licensing group where we can start off, and when there's more staff on hand, we could add members or splinter off so we can get started on the work now.
Sounds like that's what we have to do.
I will volunteer to be on that committee and splinter off wherever you want me to splinter.
Yeah.
I would support that because already the training committee has just an unimaginably huge task. And I can't imagine how licensing is going to go on that, at least right now. And so the idea that maybe, the clinical licensing piece could be part of a general licensing group for now, so that we can get wheels under this thing and get it moving, I would support that.
We also need a sourcing committee immediately to start figuring out where the psilocybin is going to come from. I mean, that needs to be figured out. Like that's a #1 priority.
That's absolutely true. It's going to shape all of the downstream.
So I would propose that maybe
if the organizational challenge is to just organize, if there's more committees, it's difficult to make more meetings and whatnot. But if we can lump it all into one committee, and we know that most of us are going to be joining that committee, and we're going to be separating out and thinking about these different things within that committee, and that's how we have to start, then that's how we have to start. I mean, that's
one of the licensing responsibilities is the manufacture of the products, and a second one is testing. And would that mix in with sourcing? Isn't that the same thing as sourcing?
I think, for sourcing, I think you have to realize what we're being tasked with here, right? Mm-hmm. In less than 2 years now, so we're already 4 months into this. We don't know whether we're synthesizing psilocybin from scratch in a laboratory, whether we're giving people some natural mushroom product, cultivating mushrooms and extracting psilocybin from it. How are you delivering the product to the clients? This all has to be worked out, and it's not a side project. It's
oh no, I understand.
So I know you know this, Barb. I mean,
can we clarify that these are product licenses we're talking about? So it's not a centralized project.
No, but there needs to be a whole, licensing separate from, deciding what the source is going to be, and if it's a mushroom, which mushrooms, which species, how's it going to be grown, how's it going to be isolated? I mean, the list of questions is quite long.
Go ahead, Todd. I think you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so these are all super important concerns. On the one hand, it sounds like we have tremendous need and tremendous enthusiasm and energy from some of the board members about focusing on some of these important issues. And on the other hand, we have it sounds to me like the big barrier is, first of all, just administrative bandwidth to schedule conferences, conference calls. And secondly, the opportunity cost, how many committees can the board members serve on? I wonder if there's a way of proposing for interested board members to form these committees. And then is it allowable to have them, I don't know, outsource the admin support, or get one of their staff to volunteer as the phone call administrator, et cetera, until we can get funding?
And there is support out there already, as many of you know.
So here in the discussion, I mean, my take is there's a lot of concern about licensing. It's clear it can be split or lumped. It seems clear, there seems to be wide agreement that the ball needs to get rolling. I mean, it does seem that it might be a reasonable place to start as a more broadly oriented committee that kind of makes some deliberations about, sort of kind of getting the lay of the land, defining what work needs to be done in what order. And then from there, sort of, getting more specialized and focused. And that should align well with the sort of onboarding of more administrative support. But because it just sort of sounds like to me that there's not necessarily total agreement on like what it's going to look like, or how centralized or not centralized it's going to be, or who's going to be doing what. And maybe a licensing subcommittee could start, because I think it starts with defining. We need to define, the parameters and the framework, and then I think it might be easier to really settle on, okay, what subcommittees do we really need?
I agree.
So I think we can start taking this incrementally, and not try to get overwhelmed by the kind of breadth of this, and have a licensing subcommittee that starts taking on a portion of licensing, whether it's the actual facilitator or the service center, and start there, and then start a products related subcommittee. So talking about or discussing the issues that Mason brought up related to what products are going to be available for consumption. And then eventually that gets into testing and manufacturing as well. And, everything's licensed, right? So let's not get hung up on licensing as its own subcommittee, because everything is going to be licensed in this regulatory scheme. So maybe kind of dividing it up into functionality rather than the fact that something needs to be licensed or not.
Yeah. So what are we proposing? Like a product and lab and testing subcommittee, then a service center. A service center would stand alone as a subcommittee, and then, or would that be facilitator, service center, licensing kind of rolled up? You could do that, I suppose. And then the training is off on its remains. So that's two, right? Loosely what we call product, which includes lab testing and everything in that world. And then
I think cannabis we call it
facilitator.
Product and product integrator.
Yeah. And I can see facilitator and service center licensing being rolled up in the beginning as they work together.
Make a motion that we form a licensing subcommittee to talk about facilitator and service center licensing.
I'll second that.
Yep.
Okay. And all those opposed, any opposition to a licensing subcommittee that would include facilitators and service centers? All right, hearing none, we have one more subcommittee added. And now
Before we move on, sorry to interrupt. Before we move on, I move that Mason be the chair of the licensing subcommittee.
Second it.
I get
I second it.
any of those opposed? All right, hearing none. Congratulations, Dr. Marks.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a motion to form one more subcommittee on products.
Second.
Sorry. Anyone opposed to a products-related subcommittee at this point? All right, hearing none. We now have a product subcommittee. Do we have any nominations for a chair?
Yeah, I'd like to nominate Jesse Ewan.
I'll second that.
Anybody opposed? All right, hearing none. Congratulations, Dr. Yearling. Okay, so we still need to have some membership formed. We do have our chairs of these two new subcommittees. So I'd be happy to take membership nominations or anyone that wants to volunteer.
I will volunteer for the, I would volunteer for either, but I've been subject to 2 different licensing boards, so I know a little bit more about that than products.
That'd be great, David.
And I would like to serve on the licensing subcommittee also. Barb.
And I would like to be on the licensing committee also.
So Dr. Knox, I would too. And for the record, I would like to be present at all subcommittees until we can identify equity lens folks to also participate in these committees, just to ensure that our process is ubiquitously equity centered. So I will play that role for now.
Okay.
Aren't we all invited to subcommittees? I mean, I've been attending all of them just to inform myself.
Yeah. Anyone can join, and I think we're talking about specific membership. So Rachel, would you like membership in all of the subcommittees, or are you just asking to?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
Anyone opposed to the idea? Okay, hearing none, that's
I'm sorry to go back to this beginning, but do we need a quorum for each subcommittee to meet? Or is that only for the full committee? That's my only concern. That
well, you don't need a quorum to meet, but you just need a quorum to vote.
Okay.
So if you're going to hold any votes, you're going to have a majority of people there, and then it's a majority of majority would pass the vote. And I'm sorry, I was looking down and taking notes on the products subcommittee. Who else? Did we have any other volunteers?
Dealing with the product committee.
I'd like to.
Okay, Dr. Carter.
And Steph.
And I'm sorry, who else? And staff. Thank you, staff.
I'd like to be on that committee as well. This is Mason.
Okay.
Products committee.
I would also like to be on that committee.
Was that David?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm looking down and writing membership at the same time as listening to you guys. Okay, I think we'll just do it this way. Anyone got any problem with the membership of these committees?
Andre, I'd like to join the licensure committee as well as the training committee, if that's okay.
Okay, Sarah. Okay, this is great. I think we've got a good start on how we're going to start splitting up the work, and there'll be plenty of work to come. So if you're not sure on what subcommittee you want to join yet, there'll be plenty of time to join later, and then the work will shift as we go through these meetings. So I think that's manageable. I think that way we can start taking these aspects piecemeal. I would say that the subcommittees probably need to look at Measure 109 for their specific area of interest on kind of the skeleton outline of where to start. Like I said, we'll get a project manager that will have a much better skill set than me in organizing everybody and getting people on track and getting recommendations in order for the agency to start making rules. All right. Wow, that took a lot of time. So we're at 3:45. We'll have to adjust. I think we'll have to adjust the agenda a little bit. So do we have any more discussion on subcommittees?
I just want to acknowledge one that Tom raised, I think would be very important. We can probably put it off a little bit, but the data and tracking, I think, would be very important to consider maybe next at some point.
Okay.
And the research subcommittee has been having some discussion of that, and that might fall into that domain.
Yeah, I would agree that that would be well within the research.
I'm talking more about how data is used, so client information, how that's going to be protected, also how the products will be tracked. That some of that might fall under the product committee, but I think in general, data protection, data use, data privacy might be its own thing, but you know, that's something we can probably table for now.
Okay. Yeah, I would think tracking would probably would fall under the product subcommittee at some point, and Mr. Ricks can certainly represent that subject matter when the time comes.
There's, like Mason
okay.
said, there's supply chain data, and then there's clinical data, right? In quotes, clinical data. So it's two discrete types of data that we'll need to collect.
Can we put this on the agenda for next time? Make sure we move along.
I'm sorry, Tom. What did you want to?
I was just saying, let's put that on the agenda for next time. I think we should move along.
The data tracking, etc. Okay. Okay, so we can have to make a little bit of a decision on adjusting our agenda at this point. What I had for today was to have a discussion and maybe some nominations for chair and vice chair, and then a possible public comment period. So what I'm proposing is that we do one or the other today, since we have about 13 minutes left. And I'd be willing to entertain a motion on what we want to do with our remaining time.
I'd like to move
If
to have
people are
for the appointment of chair and co-chair.
Okay.
Second that.
I'm sorry, could you restate that motion, Jesse? I think I spoke over you.
Problem. I said I'd like to move to have a discussion for the appointment of chair and co-chair.
I second that.
And Tom seconded. Okay, thank you. I'll open up the floor to anyone.
I believe last time.
Anybody want to be the chair?
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just asking, does anyone want to be the chair? I mean, I think people should nominate themselves because it will be a lot of work and we don't want to pressure somebody into it who really isn't able to. So I was just wondering if there's anybody interested in that role.
May I have an estimate of the time that will be required monthly?
I think from my experience, it's going to be officially with the agency, maybe 2 hours a month to talk about the agenda and the topics under discussion. So, I mean, this is kind of, Dr. Knox knows that, about before each meeting, about a couple weeks before each meeting, you'll get with the agency and we'll discuss the agenda topics that the chair wants to propose for the next meeting. I know I can't, I can't say how much time you're going to take on your own thinking about, guiding the board forward and other questions that are going to pop up in the interim that you're going to need, questions from me or other aspects of the agency. And then, the actual meeting that, I'm going to sit back and assume my ex officio role once we get a program manager and a chair, and then they're going to really pretty much run the show between the two of them. So, you'll be running a meeting if you're the chair, or if you're absent that day, the vice chair will be doing that. So it's a few extra hours, and I'm not counting the personal time that you'll be thinking and strategizing on your own.
What is the authority of the chair? What are their duties and responsibilities? Is it purely administrative?
So I'm just going to go to the draft bylaws, which I don't have up. They're really, the authorities that they have a lot of say on the agenda with the agency. And that's really I think the real power of the chair and advisory board is setting the agenda, and moving that forward. That being said, in the next 2 years, what needs to get done is pretty prescriptive. So you're not going to have too much leeway in setting your own agenda. That's going to, our obligations to get this set up are going to kind of dictate the agenda. And then kind of recognizing who speaks, if you want to move forward with items or not. I think we've all kind of witnessed how chairs operate during meetings. So they are a facilitator, and they do have the ability to recognize people to speak. So not a lot of authority.
My understanding is they also speak on behalf of the board with the press, right? So they represent the board to the public, and they can call meetings. They can call meetings. I don't remember what the term is for them, but they can call meetings kind of ad hoc meetings.
Andre, how long is the appointment? Is it 2 years?
Well, that'd be determinative of the bylaws. But right now, it's a 1-year term, and then you have elections at the end of each year.
I'd like to throw my hat in the ring for a chair.
In that light, I would move that Tom be the chair.
I'll second that.
I'll second that. Sorry. Okay, so
Tom, is that
anyone?
I will third it if I can confirm that's a unicorn tapestry in back of you.
That's a very old tapestry from Cherie's side.
All right. Well, that's still good enough for me.
Well, hearing a first, second, and a third, I would invite any discussion. Tom, if you'd like to have a stump speech, you can. If you'd like to defer that, we can go straight to a vote.
Oh, I probably will defer that. I think that, I'd be excited to help you guys shape the vision, certainly carrying the spirit of Cherie and I from the early days, but I'm super excited to have the opportunity to be working with all of you and to take it to the next level. So it would be an honor.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Anyone opposed to Tom's chairmanship? All right. Hearing none, congratulations, Tom, on the chair of the Psilocybin Advisory Board. And thank you for volunteering.
Right on. Thank you, guys. I definitely am honored to be working with you all and look forward to hammering this out and making the absolute best possible program we can. And I think, we're in the midst of making history. I'm just real thrilled to be in it with all of you. So, I'd love to get on to thinking about vice chair.
All right. Do I hear any nominations for vice chair?
I would like to nominate. I know we're pushing for self-nomination, but actually, I would like to nominate Kim, Althea, and Mason.
Nice.
For vice chair. Also with a note, I would love to see otherwise sort of first right of refusal to some diversity. Those of us who represent diversity.
Can I just say, I can't be the vice chair, and I so appreciate the nomination, but it's more work than I can handle on my plate. So I'm going to politely decline.
What is the role of the vice chair exactly?
You get a great title and you just sit back and watch the chair work.
Can I leave?
No.
Andre, that is not true. I tried to explain our first meeting, the precarious position I was put in as vice chair my first year on the Oregon Cannabis Commission, having to step into that chair role without being prepared. So, but through my experience, I would say that the vice chair's role is to be a de facto co-chair, right? Where you know everything that chair knows and you're ready to step in at a moment's notice. You support one another, of course, but it is a shared responsibility.
Yeah, I would say in all seriousness, there's a lot of collaboration between the chair and the vice chair. And, at those meetings with the agency and setting the agenda, the vice chair is there. So, it is like a co-chairmanship in presenting ideas and topics for discussion.
And
I actually would like to make a motion. I would love to make a motion to consider having, instead of a chair and a co-chair, having a chair and 2 vice chairs. I've seen this work really well. I've seen this work really well in CPOT. And it absolutely helps broaden that shared responsibility quite a bit.
I could use the help.
Now, given the time crunch, is this something we should kind of finish discussing at the next meeting? Or?
Oh, we got 4 minutes.
I can say that I feel like I'm for that. That would be great to have 2 vice chairs if that matters.
So my preference, I'm willing to consider being a vice chair. If there's someone else who's interested, I've got plenty on my plate. So my preference would be to defer to that other person. But if there isn't someone else to fill that role, I'm willing to fill it.
So we have 2 nominees right now, Althea, and who else was nominated?
Mason.
Rachel nominated me. I appreciate that. I think if Althea would like to do that, I'd be fine with that.
If we do 2, are you interested?
Not if his preference is, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, to be honest, we discussed having 2 chairs. And so I don't know why we would then go and have 2 vice chairs. It doesn't seem to make sense to me to do that. Really.
Angela, are you interested in vice chair or co-vice?
That. I have experience chairing boards multiple times. I would be more than happy to help with that.
I move that Angela be vice or co-vice chair.
I second that.
Third.
Let's take it to a vote.
Okay. Anyone opposed?
We're voting on both Althea and Angela right now.
Oh, thanks for clarifying.
Well, we didn't. I made the motion for 2 vice chairs. We actually didn't second
We
that
didn't
or
vote on
approve
that.
it. So I think we're still on 1.
Okay.
So let's take one at a time. Let's do the motion. Vote on the motion for 2 vice chairs.
Second.
Okay. Any opposition? All right. Such an agreeable group. Okay. So now we have 2 vice chairs, and then we have a second motion to vote on, and that was the candidacy of both Athir and Angela. And anybody opposed? All right, hearing none, congratulations. So the three of you, we'll, for the next meeting, we'll be in touch and we'll have a discussion on how we're going to organize our next meeting going forward. All right, we got about a minute left. These meetings are actually moving by very fast, even though they are 3 hours. Thank you everybody for your discussion. This is a very enthusiastic and group, and you guys are very diligent. Sarah, do you have one last comment?
I do. Is this going to be a standing time for meetings in the month?
So that's with our last 30 seconds or so. I did want to talk about that a little bit. Generally speaking, we would set a year's worth of meetings at the same kind of time and day of the week going forward. We just haven't had a chance to do that. So we were doing this doodle poll game once a month. I think this time at this day was working for all but maybe 2 or 3 members for the last 2 meetings. And I want to be really sensitive to everybody's time and availability. So I would prefer we have unanimity in when we meet, but I know that's not always possible. For May, we can either do a doodle poll or we can just say the last Wednesday of the month, 1 to 4 is really what's seems to be a consistent time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine with me. It would be nice to have them scheduled a good ways out because it's a little easier for me to move things around and be more available. And last, Wednesday of the month at 1 p.m. is fine. But it'd be nice to sort of agree if that's going to be it, then agree to it. There are other times that work also if that's bad for folks, but I'm mainly sort of advocating for, as soon as possible, let's schedule it, a good ways out.
So we can do the doodle poll and again, or we can just say we're going to meet last Wednesday of May, and then kind of push back the rest of the meetings again.
I would like to, because I'm one of the people that this is a very challenging time for, if I would like to offer maybe one more doodle poll and then have that, if this ends up being the time that really is what's best for everybody, I'll adjust my schedule. And have, okay. I think having it regular is very important, but perhaps we could try once more.
Okay, let's do that. So look out for that doodle poll for May. And then we'll get the rest of the meetings for the rest of the year scheduled out based on just a consistent time. I want to thank everybody for their participation. I want to thank the public for being really great observers. And I'm sorry we couldn't get a public comment period into this meeting. I will look to try to do that in future meetings. But just realize that any rulemaking will have required public comment periods, so the public will certainly have their chance for input before anything becomes a rule or regulation related to this. So thank you, everybody. Great conversation today, and look forward to speaking to you all in the future.